Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to first thank Jay Famiglietti and the Global Institute for Water Security for lending assistance to this through the help of Michelle and Mark and our audiovisual team, and then, of course, to John Pomeroy and Global Water Futures for underwriting this seminar series, most critically. Next week, we have Barbara Sherwood Lawler. She's joining us from University of Toronto. And this will be a lecture given in Convocation Hall. So next week, we will not be here, but we'll be in Convocation Hall across campus. Please join us there. It'll be at the same time and day, just a different location. And also, stay with us after today's seminar. There'll be tea and coffee and cookies out front, and we'd love to continue the discussion after the seminar. But today I have the real pleasure of welcoming Adam Ward, from the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. I've known Adam, I think, for the last 10 years or so. We were just trying to maybe dial in that date when we might have met at a bar in San Francisco at AGU, and his hair was much longer than it is now, and he was a scruffy PhD student. Adam did his PhD at Penn State University in civil engineering. His previous degrees were in engineering as well. He's a licensed engineer. And from 2011 to 2015, he was an assistant professor at University of Iowa, and since 2015, he's been at Indiana University. In this short period of time, I think Adam has really distinguished himself as a thought leader in river corridor research, hyperradial exchange flows, and this has been, I think, recognized through several honors. He's Outstanding Junior Faculty Award for 2018. This is from Indiana University. He's a Vanguard Fellow from the Institute of Advanced Studies at University of Birmingham in the UK. He's won 3 Editor's Choice Awards, 2 from WRR and 1 from another journal in the last 5 years or so. And most importantly, in 2016, he received an NSF Career Award. This is very special in the United States, and it's really, you look at the who's who and senior leaders in the field in the US, and that largely has been a springboard, I think, for greatness, so no pressure on that one, Adam. Adam has done a lot of service in his short time as an assistant professor, serving as secretary for CWASI, this consortium of universities that we are also a part of. He's an associate editor for both Water Resources Research and the journal Groundwater, and it's just really a pleasure to have Adam with us. He's a very enthusiastic, articulate hydrologist in our community and a real leader in this area of catchment hydrology. So Adam, thanks for making the journey, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Jeff, and that violates the agreed upon, just tell him my name and I'll take it from there. But thank you very much for the kind words, and thanks to all for hosting me up here. First visit up to Saskatoon. So what I'd like to talk about today is how water solutes energy move in the river corridor, the river and the near stream, floodplain, aquifer, hyporheic zone, riparian zone. And broadly, I think if that's not your area of interest, I hope this talk will hit a little bit more on the philosophical or theoretical side. And you can see parallels in your own discipline and where your discipline's evolution might be, whether it's a very young and emerging space or whether it's a well-established, more classical area of research. So as we get into that, there are too many collaborators to thank because this is something of a synthesis of work that I've been pursuing for about a decade now. But the folks on the screen have contributed mightily. And I particularly note Aaron Packman here. He's a co-author on an opinion piece that's currently being reviewed that echoes a lot of the themes that we'll talk about today. Okay, so I like to start broadly, and I think this will resonate with folks in the room. Why am I a hydrologist in the first place? What are the challenges here? And for most of us, hydrology, hydrologic science, water resources research, this is in the space of, at least for physical hydrologists, we think about what are those processes and mechanisms that are operating on the landscape. Where's water or the solute that we're interested in, whether that's arsenic or noble gases being transported through the subsurface? Where is that stored? How does it move? Where does it move? Residence time is on there. How long does it stay in a given place? And if we're doing really well, we try to think about scaling that up to how we conceptualize systems, not just studying a process or a store, but building that knowledge into a conceptual model or into something of a theory that we can take from the place we learned to another location and have confidence that we have some predictive power. Right? We have the ability to distill these complicated open systems that we call watersheds into something that's got some pattern or some predictive ability in it. What gets me particularly excited about hydrology is when we start to entangle ourselves with other disciplines. And so I have been asked by colleagues, why are you in a school of public and environmental affairs? That doesn't sound much like hydrology or environmental science. And while we do have a strong environmental science group, it's because I get to play with folks who aren't environmental scientists and who aren't hydrologists, and we get to find where does ecology overlap with this work? How do we manage this? And so those very same themes that inspire me to try and work sort of across these rings, if you will, I think are really modeled here from the introduction I got from Jay this morning at the Global Water Futures Institute. So I'd like to start here. Noel Hines, father of stream ecology. And this is where my journey begins in terms of river corridor exchange. We must not divorce the stream from its valley. If we do, we lose touch with reality. And that is a bold statement to make in the early 70s when we're trying to manage water resources and explicitly write legislation and policy that separates surface waters, largely about flooding and drinking water supply for big cities, from groundwaters, where we're often thinking about droughts in terms of irrigation, and we're thinking about sort of slow-moving classical hydrogeology contaminant transport problems. And Noel Hines, I think this quote very nicely summarizes the motivation for my career, which is, streams are nothing more than the places that groundwater ran out of ground. Right? We only have flow in a stream because we couldn't keep that flow in the saturated subsurface. And so the water table itself is continuous across that interface, and we shouldn't treat the system like it could be so readily divided between surface and subsurface. There's been a lot of work from there. I'm going to use the term river corridor to broadly refer to all of the processes that are on the screen right now. The idea that a river or a stream and the landscape, let's call it the nearby landscape, are very tightly connected. There's flows of water, solutes, nutrients, energy, organisms in between the surface and subsurface. I'm not sure where we ought to draw the boundary between what I call the river corridor and what you all would call an aquifer, or broadly think of as groundwater. I'm typically thinking about exchange processes that are happening over scales that are up to perhaps a few meters. 10 meters would be an awfully large scale for me to think about, with time scales on the order of perhaps days. So think of these as the shortest and fastest parts of the groundwater system. So when I talk about the river corridor, this is sort of the mental model I'd like you to have. And part of why we're so interested is because this river corridor represents a really intriguing interface from an ecological perspective or a contaminant perspective. As we go from the surface water into the subsurface, we go from light to dark. In the summertime, we go from hot to cool, and of course that can reverse in the winter. We go from aerobic to anaerobic conditions. And as we move water and solutes along that gradient, we get all sorts of ecosystem services that we benefit from as a species. So we process hydrocarbons here. We may sequester heavy metals from mine tailings. We've got things like sport fish that we all enjoy going out and casting a line for, who spend a portion of their life cycle living in that shallow subsurface. So we've got reasons to care about river corridors. For today's talk, in your mind, when I talk about river corridors and why I'm motivated, you can think of Fisher's description of this as a river's liver. Right? You get a lot of contaminant processing, a lot of removal of things that you wouldn't like to keep in the system in that shallow subsurface. In the agricultural landscapes where I currently live and where we are now, we associate this flux with denitrification as yet another example of the kinds of benefits we get from having this liver in our system, so to speak. And this is flow through the subsurface. I've got to have one equation in a talk. I am an engineer. Anyone know this one? We've got, yes? Yeah? What is it? Darcy's Law, yes. All right, so well before we thought about river corridor exchange, we did understand something about flow through porous media. And I think it's instructive to look at this just to get our heads around the problem, because in fact, we know a lot about this already. Right? We know that the amount of flow that's moving along a flow path and the time scale that it may spend there has something to do with the physical structure of the system that we're moving through, manifested here as hydraulic conductivity. And we know that it's got something to do with hydraulic gradients that are providing that energy source or the head to ultimately move water around. And so we know that those things are going to vary in space. We know that they may vary in time. But in general, the idea that this is a process that has something to do with geologic setting, where we are, what materials we're in, how they're shaped, how they're organized, and that it's got something to do with the hydrodynamic system that's operating on top of it is well known, well accepted. So these are a couple of plots. On the left, you can see publications, and these were some keyword searches on hyporeac zones in particular. And on the right, you can see citations. And that red arrow denotes the quote from Hines that I showed you all earlier. So just imagine all of the knowledge we must have about river corridor exchange. We have thousands of publications, and we're at least citing ourselves pretty frequently, and potentially even having others cite us. So you would imagine that after, what are we going on, 45 years here of studying river corridor exchange and thinking about these ideas, we ought to be able to operationalize this knowledge. We should be able to design river systems to do what we want, to identify places, times where we're gaining these ecosystem services. Where might we want to protect? What might a restoration project look like? And so with all that knowledge, the way that Aaron and I chose to break it down was to think about sort of independent variables and dependent variables. And so in the vertical column here, you can see a list of common independent variables that people study. Right? What are the things that should modulate or control this exchange process? And so in purple, you see ones that are associated with hydrology, things like discharge or groundwater inflows to a stream. And in the blue, you see things that we lump together as geologic setting. So are we bedrock constrained or not? Steep or flat? Highly incised, not incised? And so we started to look through the literature and ask, okay, what do we have here in terms of predictive power? And so, oh, I'm sorry, the across the top there where it says metric of exchange, we took our dependent variables here to be something about exchange flux, transit time, so how long did water or solute spend in that liver, in that hyporeac zone, or the geometry of that exchange. And as we started to look, we first looked at exchange flux, how much water moves across. And in a non-exhaustive survey, just pulling papers that we could think of, we found broad support that there is either an increase or a decrease or occasionally no effect of stream discharge on exchange flux. And that's troubling, right? That suggests maybe we don't know as much as we hoped. That was true for transit times. That was true for flow path geometry. And that was true nearly across the board. And I suspect that if we would scour the literature, I could turn most of these into pluses and minuses. And so what have we been doing then? Right? We've got this body of work that we've amassed over the last 45 years from all different perspectives. So biological systems, chemical systems, physical hydrology. And we all thought we knew what the independent and dependent variables were, and we've come up with these models to explain things. And when we back up half a step, it turns out there's almost nothing but conflict out there. And so this is really the motivation of what I'd like to explore today. Why does this conflict arise, and what do we do about it? I'll do that through the lens of river corridor exchange, but you can map this to your own discipline and think about when in time your discipline sort of made this leap from being an assemblage of facts to an organized discipline that has a theory or a basis that allows you to transfer your knowledge and assimilate new knowledge from new field sites or new methods that come online. And I think, what we would like ultimately is we would like large-scale predictive power. We would like to say things like, these processes matter or they don't matter in these kinds of places for these reasons. So we want predictions at broad spatial scales And so on the left side of your screen, you can see some conceptual models that I've pulled that are trying to get us out to river basin scales. However, the business of most scientists, I think, has not been trying to get to larger and larger scales. Instead, we've moved from left to right across this slide. We zoom in, right? Well, why did that process happen? Let's study the underlying dynamics. And so we've continued to zoom in to processes that are occurring at scales that are smaller than individual grains. We're looking at dead-end pore space in individual sediment grains as an important process and exchange mechanism. And we also want to aggregate that to the scale of the Mississippi River Basin to understand how much denitrification we might expect. So we're trying to work across 12 orders of magnitude in spatial scale here. And I think that's where some of the challenge comes from. I study my place at my scale with my method, and I assume that everything else in the world will work out well. As an example, let's take a cross-section of a stream. You can see the skill I have as an artist here on full display. And we're going to look at what happens in the river corridor when it rains. And so let's take first a landscape-centric view, and since Jeff did the introduction, we can pick on Jeff a little bit here. So when it rains, stream flow goes up. Good. We've got that one under control as hydrologists. That's where we came from, right? Predicting how high will it go and making sure we didn't flood. And from a very landscape-centric view of the world, that stream went up because the water tables rose in the hill slopes in the riparian zones, and they moved water through the subsurface into the stream. Now, the logical conclusion there is that you've got steeper gradients toward the stream. That's going to squish those exchange flow paths, as I've shown in the dark blue arrow. Right? So every hill slope hydrologist worth their salt knows when it rains, you compress these hyporheic zones. But folks who started working in the stream, so thinking about maybe river hydraulics and open channel flow, have a very different perspective of the world. Every one of them knows that when it rains and stream water goes up, that stream water pushes out into the bank, and you get bank storage. And so this is one example that I pulled where, depending on what discipline you came from, where you were trained, you bring your own baggage to the table. Right? You bring a conceptual model with you, and everything about your experimental design, your data collection, your interpretation stems from this conceptual model that you brought. So it's not hard to imagine that both of these conceptual models have been published broadly. They both have a lot of support in the literature, and they provide fundamentally opposing perspectives on how our system should respond to rainfall. Right? This is the kind of problem that we're looking at. And that conceptual baggage is hugely prevalent through the conceptual models that we've published across these scales. Multiply that by responses to disturbances like floods or droughts, human activity, stream restoration structures being involved. Look at different elements of hydrologic forcing, geologic setting with your favorite method or your favorite model. And it's not hard to then get your head around why we've got these conflicting predictions in the river corridor. We've got a lot of baggage here. Right? We all bring our favorite method or our favorite model. We bring it from the site, perhaps, that we were trained and did our PhD research, and we take it to a new place. And we sort of assume implicitly that the model that I was operating with in one landscape ought to still hold true in this other landscape. It's quite rare that we explicitly test that. We almost take it as a given and design our research around it. And so, what I would say is the state of river corridor exchange, and I'll substantiate this in a moment with my own research and pick on myself to protect the other innocent in the room. What we have is a collection of observations. We have been very successful at understanding all sorts of mechanisms and functions associated with river corridor exchange. But they're all highly conditional. We have a body of one-off observations. This place, this time, this method, or with this model, we understand the world. What we haven't done is figure out how do we synthesize that into an organized framework or get to this place where we have predictive power. Because a regulator doesn't really want to know it's confusing. A regulator wants to know that stretch of river is more important to protect than this one. I can tell you why. This restoration is a better design than that one, and I can tell you why. And at the present time, we can't do that. That's what I'm after here. So, I thought that was going to build itself in later. Sure, how can we know so much and have this inability? So what we'll do today is focus on what I highlighted in red, in-stream discharge, right? Stream flow, the very thing that makes it a stream and not a pond or a wetland, right? Open channel flow. How does that affect stream transit time? So the time that water or the solutes it carries spend in the river corridor. So we're going to just unpack this one and look at it across several spatial scales today. So all the work that I'll show you today comes out of about a decade of research that I've conducted at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. So this is a long-term ecological reserve site in the Cascade Range in the US. So we're looking at a mountainous watershed. This is a fifth-order basin. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by zooming in on two headwater catchments in the lower portion of the elevation. It's a paired catchment study. And in particular, we're going to zoom in on two highly studied sections of those that are about 30 meters long. So we'll start there, and we'll eventually, I hope, get back all the way out to the broadest scales. I chose these sites because starting in the early 90s, a very extensive monitoring network was established there by Steve Wenzel, one of my collaborators. And since then, these sites have been studied I think more than any other sites in the world for river corridor exchange, hyporheic exchange. So if we can't make sense of the world here, we have very little hope of doing it in a new site. And so we're going to build on that momentum. And the first thing that we asked was, how different is this between these two catchments? So they're paired, they're almost exactly the same size and drainage area. They've got the same modern land management. They're both gauged. And so the big contrast then is that watershed 1 on your left has a wider valley, and watershed 3 on the right has a very narrow valley. To give you some sense, these are headwater mountain catchments, so they're anywhere from 10 to 14% slope in the down valley direction, and in many places the hill slopes are too steep to comfortably climb. So highly incised streams, bedrock on the sides, bedrock on the bottom. So this alluvial package is actually very clearly defined because it's got bedrock surrounding it. So that helps, right? That removes some complexity from the system. And so I want to show you a series of solute tracer injections that we did. We went out to the system and we dripped salty water, so tracer labeled water, into the stream for 48 hours. And then we monitored in those wells in the shallow subsurface to ask questions like, when did that tracer arrive? When did it leave? What was the average time scale that connected the stream to the valley bottom? And in our two watersheds, we did that 4 times through baseflow recession. And that took us across about an order of magnitude in flow, from about 40 liters per second early in the year to less than 1 liter per second in the late portion of the season. And so we're getting discharge, repeat the experiment at these two sites, very, very similar sites. So we're optimistic we'll be able to isolate this valley width or this geological control. Rather than plots, let's do it with a movie. And so what you're going to see is that our tracer in red start to appear in the shallow subsurface. And these are interpolated from measurements that we made. So you can see watershed 1 across the top, watershed 3 across the bottom, and how red that color looks, that's how much tracer is there. And so as we look, I hope if you at least blur your eyes and tilt your head a little bit, things don't look all that different to me. Right? Even though discharge dropped by more than an order of magnitude, generally speaking, these patterns don't look different. And we can watch that. So that was the peak of our injection, and then our tracer slowly fades back away. And we'll get a little more quantitative here about the patterns. So there's our first injection in watershed 1 on the left and 3 on the right again. And what you're seeing in color is when did the peak of that tracer arrive? So there's sort of a peak travel time, or the most frequent transit time that was there. And the darker the color, the longer that was, the less well connected that sampling location is to the stream, would be the interpretation. So we did that for these two catchments, and we asked questions like, are they different from one another? They are. And are those patterns consistent as you move away from the stream? They're not. They're opposing one another. And that's all we need to know about those plots for the moment. And we did that across all those discharges. And what I want you to do is just focus here where I've got the blue arrows and the blue circles, right? There is a class of flow paths that are very near the stream for whom nothing changed. Right? Base flow goes up, base flow goes down. Flow path doesn't care. Right? Its function is essentially independent of stream discharge. And those are the ones very close to the stream. In contrast, the ones that are farther away from the stream, on the margins here, those ones were highly sensitive to discharge. And we saw lots of variation through the season. And so all of the conceptual models that told us what's nearest the stream should be most connected to the stream discharge didn't apply to this site. Right? In fact, we found the opposite. If you're near the stream, you're near perhaps a big step, and that has a steep hydraulic gradient across it, and a little bit of fluctuation in discharge doesn't change the fact that a big step is still a big step. Right? And that's what we think is happening here, that the features are so big, this seasonal variation didn't affect them. When we look at the slope of those timescales through the year, so a slope of 0 meaning my timescale didn't change whatsoever, warmer colors meaning my time took longer, and cooler colors meaning faster, we see again, right near the stream, no change, insensitive to discharge. Out in the valley margins, very sensitive to discharge. So what's happening in the river corridor here seems that we've got this class of flow paths near the edges who are more responsive to, I think, what's happening on the hill slopes and the way the hill slope evapotranspiration is getting translated into the valley bottom. So that's the smallest scale we'll look at. Does river corridor exchange vary with discharge? We'll ask that question at each scale today. And the answer here is it depends. Which flow path do you mean? The ones near the stream didn't change. The ones in the valley margins did change. Oh, did you mean the ones in the highly constrained valley? Well, those changed, but in the opposite direction. And so this example, I hope, really starts to drive home the point that the way we've studied this, as though one thing, stream discharge, could explain all of the complexity in the system, doesn't seem to make a lot of sense as we dig into it. Right? Isolating one independent variable, which is exactly what we would have been trained to do in a laboratory experiment, doesn't work in these systems because they're changing in this integrated multi-scale way. And we're going to keep driving that point home by looking at some different scales. Okay, so let's go up in order of magnitude in space. What we were just looking at is in that red box, and so that was about 30 meters of the river corridor, and now we're gonna go out to a few hundred meters. And this work, I'll note, is largely the work of Noah Schmodel, who's now a researcher at the US Geological Survey from his postdoc time in my group. So we're gonna go now to the magenta box. Right? We're gonna go up a scale here. And what we're going to look at is those flow paths that we saw along the stream centerline. And we're going to do this one with a model instead of field experiment. So we're going to model the stream centerline. We'll have surveyed the topography, and we'll have surveyed the water surface continuously for a year. So we're going to look at how variable this might be over the course of 1 year. We did this. This was a two-dimensional model in ComSol multiphysics. In the key take-home, I suppose, is that we simulated a lot. So this was about 550 meters of river corridor. We simulated the release of a particle every 10 centimeters along the stream bed, every hour for an entire calendar year. And so that means we tracked about 44 million particles through this model. And so the idea behind doing this was to say, well, sure, low base flow to lower base flow, that might not have made such a difference, but we know that flow at this system is highly variable. We know there are storm events. Surely that makes a difference. Right? We just picked too calm of a period to study. And so what you're seeing in the image here are some different model runs, just to give you a sense of what it looks like to track that density of particles and the variation that we get in flow paths from, I'll walk over here, from very small ones at individual features to very long flow paths that span multiple features in the river corridor. So 44 million data points look like this. So this is every one of those particles through time as you move in the lateral direction and through space as you move in the vertical. Okay? And they've been color-coded here by how long they spent in the river corridor. So when you see blue colors, those were very fast flow paths. And when you see the yellower, warmer colors, those are very long flow paths. So let me get us oriented as to how we ought to think about this. Let's see. Oh, so across the top, just to be clear, that's stream discharge across the top axis there, where the arrow that says time. And so you can see over the course of this year, we varied from about 0.1 liters per second to over 1,000 liters per second. So we looked at 40 to 4 last time. So we've upped the scale in a big way of what we're going to look at here. So what do we learn? When I look at this plot, the first thing I see are horizontal stripes. And if you considered one row of this plot, one horizontal band, what you're seeing is the same flow path every hour over the course of a year. And the fact of the matter is you don't see very much variation. Right? You see bands that are horizontal stripes and they're not changing in color. And what you interpret there is those flow paths have been present all year long and their time scale hasn't changed very much. In contrast, if you look at the vertical, so you look down a column, what you see is all the transit times at one instant. Right? And so that would be what you all heard described as a forward transit time distribution, or forward transit times, if you saw Kieran Harmon's talk a few weeks ago. And so without even doing any calculations on this, we tend to see horizontal bands more than vertical bands. There are some, but your gut should be telling you there's not a lot of variation through time, but there seems to be a lot of variation through space. Right? I see horizontal bands, not vertical bands. And indeed, if we look at the coefficient of variation in time versus in space, there's always more variation in space. So at any instant, if you walk out to that system, it matters more where you measure in space than what day you're there to measure in time. Right? So maybe discharge isn't that important. Maybe picking a representative location is more important for us. We see some other fun features here. At the very highest flows, those vertical white bars, those are times when you had rain on snow events and you were pushing all sorts of water into the valley bottom and causing lots of upwelling. So you truncated a lot of these flow paths and they never even initiated. Under these really low flow periods, you see a dry stream bed. So this is when the stream isn't a stream anymore. Right? All the flow is in the subsurface at those times. And on the next slide, what I'll show you is some slices. So these will be the forward transit time distributions. Let's take all the particles we released at that instant, and let's make a distribution out of them. That's a forward transit time distribution at that instant in time. And here are those distributions. Their probabilities are shaded, so darker colors are higher probabilities. And to help you out, this is what a few of them look like. So if you took that red dashed line and you made a transit time distribution, you would get that sort of red two-humped distribution on the right-hand side. If you took the blue dashed line, which was the highest discharge condition, you get the blue distribution and so forth. Shown in green, sort of right along the black, can be hard to pick out, is what's called a master transit time distribution. That's what happens if you put all 44 million particles together. And so what you find is that these look really unchanged through the year. There's only a few times when you even see any variation in this transit time distribution. We see a scale of fast transit times associated with individual features. We see a scale of longer transit times that we think are spanning multiple features along the river corridor. And the only real changes that we see with discharge here, at the most extreme low flows, so that red dashed line, for example, you start to build in just a little bit of probability up here in the very, very long flow paths. So there's a little bit of shifting down there. And under those really high flow conditions, the down valley part gets overwhelmed, and all of the flow takes on that feature, that characteristic time scale of individual features. So this I think is somewhat interesting, because I would have suspected that if I went out to this reach under all these different discharge conditions, that I would have measured all sorts of different transit times through the system. Because again, I still couldn't get over the idea that discharge ought to matter. And in fact, again, what we're saying is not really. Right? The highest and lowest discharges, the extremes, those do cause some variation. But for the most part, any day you went out there, 1 liter per second to 500 liters per second, you could make a representative measurement. That's actually a pretty positive message as a field scientist, because that means my observations might not be so time dependent. They might have some transferability to them. If we just look at the variation, so coefficient of variation, this is a measure of spread about the mean on the y-axis versus discharge on the x-axis. What we see is that those wet season storms, right? You see these almost hysteresis loops, right? These couple of loops that pick up at the really highs. But otherwise, all those high discharge conditions are actually quite boring to study. And the variation starts to happen when you get intermittently flowing streams, when patches, when features essentially turn off because there's no flow over them anymore, and other flow paths then activate to take their place. So it's those really low conditions that are making for interesting hydrology here, not the really high conditions. So do transit times vary with discharge? Yeah, but not that much. In fact, the largest variations were really only at the extremes. The middle 95% of that distribution of flows were functionally, could not be identified from one another in any unique way. And I talked about the transferability point already. We're optimistic that we are being highly transferable in, that our observations will be transferable. Okay, let's go up yet another scale. So we were at this magenta box that was about 500 meters. Now we're going to take a look at this entire river network. So all the things that are colored here in blue, red, and yellow. So we're going to try and look at thousands of meters, excuse me, of river network in our headwater catchment. And we're going to again ask, do things vary with discharge? Does our river corridor exchange vary in any meaningful way? And so to do so, we took a conceptual model of how these rivers function, and we turned it into a very simple mathematical model. And so this is the approach that any stream flow you see in this system I describe as a catastrophic failure of groundwater. Right? The valley bottom would rather transport that flow through the porous media. Right? Gravity's pulling it down. The only reason you get stream flow is when the porous media can't accommodate all of that flow. Okay? So if we get a spot, for example, where the valley gets wide enough or steep enough, we can pull all the stream water into the subsurface, and when that valley pinches back together, we push that flow back up. And we observe that regularly in our field system. And so we won't get into model derivation today. Instead, we'll get into flashy looking results, which are much more fun to present. And so there's our river corridor, and you can see it sliding through time, so we can see what's going on in the network. The colors are showing you how much stream flow, so surface stream flow, we think there is at any point. And if things are colored gray, that means they were modeled, but all the flow stayed in the subsurface. So here we are going through the winter, and I'll pause at our next high. Yeah, right about there. So that's about the maximum extent of stream flow that we ever see in the network. Down at the gauge, we've got a few hundred liters per second, and we see that there is active stream flow well up into these headwater systems, right? And I'm pointing up there in the network. And this matches well with the observations that we've made of stream stage. So we've had a network of, I think, 45 pressure transducers out monitoring, was the water level above or below the stream bed? And this model matches very well with those observations. And so what you can see then is these dynamic storm responses that are turning on and off portions of this network, right? All that variability when the stream bed was going wet or dry in our 500 meters, that's the same sort of variation we're seeing here throughout the network. We're seeing streams that are turning on and turning off through the season. Let's see. One last big spring storm. Let's watch that one. Yep. So the network sort of expands, and as we go through baseflow recession, it's contracting. And I'm going to jump us. We'll let it roll. What we're going to roll forward to is these summer low flows, where we get diurnal fluctuations in evapotranspiration. You can see those waggles in the stream discharge. See those flashing on and off at different parts of the network, flashing in and out on a diurnal basis? That happens here. Right? So you walk out in the stream in the afternoon in some places, and you see a damp stream bed with no evidence of flow. You think to yourself, well, how is this possible? How am I seeing hundreds of meters of damp stream bed? Go back to that place 12 hours later, and you'll see surface flow. And that's all about the evapotranspiration on the hill slopes propagating into the valley bottom. So that's creating huge variation in the stream network. So we see that play out if we look at things like, where do we have flow? So drainage area on the x-axis versus the probability that you're flowing on the y-axis. And we won't be surprised to see that there's sort of an area threshold here. Right? Once you accumulate about 20 hectares of drainage area in this particular site, you're highly likely to have flow, and that flow is almost certainly connected or contiguous to the outlet, meaning a fish could swim there, meaning you could walk up the network and never have your feet go dry. You'd never hit one of those intermittent patches. And so we think that has to do with the topology of the basin, right? How is that river network developing in this sort of fractal scaling that we see? Right? How frequent are these smaller valleys that are funneling water into the valley bottom? And similarly, we see patterns out there with catchment wetness. So if discharge at the gauge is more than about 3 liters per second, we see a network that is no longer expanding. So the difference between the network at 3 liters per second and 1,000 liters per second is minuscule. Moreover, that flat horizontal green line that you see, so here, not so green on the screens, and here, right? That means once you've got about 10 liters per second, the continuous network doesn't expand anymore. Fish habitat doesn't grow. There's always a dry patch that's controlling connectivity. There's a very small number of key places in the landscape that set these thresholds that determine sort of the maximum extent that you could ever connect along the river corridor. So what do we take away here? At high discharges, these controls seem to be set by this larger geological problem, right? How that system is weathering and evolving as a drainage network. At intermediate discharges, we see these very dynamic interactions where things are turning on and off, and there's sort of this interplay of hydrology and geology happening. At the lowest discharge, this seems to all be about the features and the valley itself. If I have a very constricted steep valley or a very constricted narrow valley, I'll get a lot of stream flow. And although we didn't observe it, we expect that there's some extreme low where you become insensitive to all of this because there's just so little water, it all stays in the valley bottom. It never peeks its head up and becomes a stream, never initiates surface flow. And so I want to take us out to one more scale. So these are it's fun to go on a talk and show some new results that no one has seen before, and so that's this part of the talk. So we wanted to go to one more scale up. So the watershed we've been focusing on is again in that magenta box in the bottom left, and now we're going to zoom out to the entirety of the H.J. Andrews. We hit 63 sites within a 10-day period to do some characterization of river corridor exchange and ask, is there a systematic variation in this process at this scale with discharge? And to be clear here, I've just pulled a presto changeo on you. We've been looking at a site under a varying discharge. So how does discharge vary through time? And now we're going to also add in how does discharge vary through space. Right? We're going to look at space in the catchment as a proxy for time. And so what we could confirm was a few things. So as expected, there's very systematic patterns in the geological variables as we move through the catchment. So streams get wider, streams get flatter, bed materials get finer. Right? These are sort of all very classic geomorphologic descriptors that confirm there's an organization to the landscape at some broad scale. So that's good. It means we're catching that gradient, and that gives us hope that we'll actually see systematic variation in the river corridor exchange processes that we look at. And I'm well aware you can't read what's on the right. That's intentional, so we don't try to get distracted by getting into the nitty-gritty of all those. Okay, so what did we find? All those yellow dots, those are our 60-some synoptic points. We'll talk about the other colors in a moment. And holdback is essentially a measure of how advection-like are you. And that's a decent proxy for how much water is being stored and not looking so much like pure plug flow advection. And so, although that's an ugly trend, there is a statistical likelihood. So the p-value makes us feel happy, sort of warm, fuzzy, that there is a real trend there. And we tested 12 different metrics that folks use to talk about river corridor exchange. I'm just pulling out holdback as one that we could look at, and frankly, one of the worst trends that we saw. So we do see, at some scale, discharge does seem to explain what we're observing. It just didn't happen at those smaller scales. The other colors on that plot, so if we take the synoptic away, were headwater sites that we repeated the study in multiple times. So just like where we started, right? We repeated the same study in the same place under different discharge conditions. And what you find is those relationships are always steeper, nearly always steeper than the trends you get across the catchment. And in every case, we find opposing directions. We find some locations for which discharge caused an increase, and others for which discharge caused a decrease. So there's some hope, maybe not complete hope. In fact, I find this slide particularly heartening because that's consistent with the work we had done maybe 8 years prior that showed these patterns were very complicated in these same headwater catchments. And so does river corridor exchange vary with discharge? Well, through space, meaning if we went out today and we all went to a different place within a watershed, we would expect systematic variation. That's responding to that organization of the catchment structure. However, if we went to one place and did our study repeatedly, we have yet to find consistent behavior there. Right? We find very little predictive power of how that stream will behave in response to discharge. But broadly speaking, we do have some hope of saying these streams are probably more likely to have exchange or have more exchange than those streams. So we're finding a scale at which we do have predictive power. It's just much larger than we ever thought it would be. So back to this for sort of a wrap up here, and this is the arm wavy part, so get your slings and arrows ready. So we started out asking, can we use discharge to predict these transit times in the river corridor? And I took you across 4 different scales and showed you broadly, not really. At best, it depends, until we got to that biggest scale finally. And I think this was actually sort of a naive way to think about the world, because the reality is it's not just discharge that varies here, right? It's all of these factors that vary. And moreover, those all vary depending on when I was there. Was I on the rising limb or falling limb of a storm event? Was it a wet or dry season prior? Where was I in the catchment? Which feature or features did I choose to study? What method or methods did I use? What model or models did I use? And so, from that perspective, right, thinking of every one of our observations as highly conditional upon place-time method, it's not surprising that what we have are contradictory findings, right? And that should be an okay feeling for us. What it suggests is we don't have the theory yet to assimilate these into one organized way of approaching the world. So what I would hope you take home from today, if it's not about river corridor exchange, are these ideas that the process that we're observing reflects a multi-scale system where larger scale properties and processes may be setting a context, and what you're observing is almost undoubtedly an aggregation of smaller scale processes. When you're observing is important, making sure you understand the context for your observation in time, that we don't particularly understand all of our measurement methods, and that while it appears that 2 of us might be doing replicate work, in fact, little differences in the way that I might make a measurement versus someone else can manifest and set us up with conceptual models that fail, and that the current way we operationalize that with conceptual or theoretical models and mathematical models are highly site dependent. Right? The model I showed you of expansion, contraction, and talked about catastrophic failure, that really only works in steep mountain streams that are highly constrained. I have no belief that that's going to be the right model to do something useful in Nebraska or here in Saskatchewan. Right? It's just a very different geological setting. And so what I've done is fall in the same traps I'm picking on people about. I've developed site-specific understanding and have yet to get to something generalizable. Where I hope we go, I hope that we start to think about multi-scale characterization, so not just the scale I'm interested in, but making sure I do a good job at the next larger scale and the next smaller scale to get that process and aggregation dynamic into my thinking. I think our community would benefit from additional standardization of what we're measuring and how we're measuring it to make sure that cross-site comparisons really ought to be undertaken. We would benefit from thinking explicitly about model data integration, so not collecting data because a model needs a parameter, but designing models that fit with the field problems that we're trying to test and really tightly coupling those parts of research. And finally, trying to organize our research in these conceptual models or theoretical models. So not just a one-off hypothesis test, but actually making sure that we go out and we assess the literature and say, this is the question I'm answering. I'm answering it because there are two different models of how a stream might respond to a storm event, and I want to know which one for this reason, and really tailoring our field campaigns to explicitly include that conceptualization and that theoretical modeling advance. I think that's where we need to be in order to get ourselves past this collection of individual observations. So that's what I had to share with you all today. Hopefully you found something helpful in there, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Adam. Looking around for hands, for questions. And as I do, I might just maybe one quick comment as I look for questions. Could it all be summed up that this all boils down to representative elementary area, and that at those smaller scales, you're just not representative of the continuum of river corridor conditions that you get at the larger scale? And is it analogous to what's seen elsewhere in hydrology, that you need to get to some, some area where the variance collapses, and now you've got some hope of being representative, and now you can make some observations that are transferable? Have you thought about that at all in that REA context?
Well, I think it's plausible that that's indeed the case. I think it very well could be that there's a scale of integration at which these processes start to collapse and become, let's say, enable useful prediction at the scale that we want to manage water resources, which I think is important for us to acknowledge. That allows us to start integrating these mechanisms into land surface models and earth system models. And so to that end of the problem, I think absolutely. Of course, there's equally many of us who want to go the other way and say, at this place, tell me what we think the dominant processes or mechanisms are. Yeah. And then we start to break down, because once we get below that scale, whatever that scale of integration is that gives us some hope to go bigger, our ability to go smaller starts to then, again, still fall apart. And so it depends what we're after. Yeah. Okay. Michelle, we need to serve coffee before the talks, rather than after the talks next time. Graham, yeah.
Thanks a lot for your talk. It's really fascinating. I wonder, if you went around the world at a whole bunch of different catchment sites, would the findings that you notice at this site be representative across those different scales? First part of the question. Oh, how transferable are my findings? Well, that's just turning my words around on me, isn't it? I don't know. We don't know, and I think that's, I think it's a big problem that we don't know. It's a very ad hoc nature that we study these systems, and I think one of the big
opportunities for us is to pick some catchments that are well studied and represent very different geological settings and very different climates, and ask that question explicitly. And in my dream world, since we've got plenty of funding for it, we would do it with biologists and ecologists and aquatic chemists on board as well. And so we would actually start to relate characterization from the grain scale to the basin scale, right? Which is a big ask, but how will we ever understand what of it is context specific and what of it is transferable? So I don't know if it's transferable, but I suspect broadly the problem, at least, the idea that we're not as sure of what we're measuring and what we should expect as we like to think when we write on an individual paper basis and we know a conclusion in our hearts, right? I think that's a transferable outcome here. I'm optimistic that at least people won't do worse and hopefully won't fall in the same traps that I've spent a decade falling in of just trying to ask when flow goes up, what happens? Hopefully this helps guide that and make it more efficient to answer that across some other question or other sites, yeah. Part one, that implies there's a part two coming though.
Jeff,
Yeah,
can I have a part two?
please.
Quickly. So it's more of a comment. I think that the framework that you put forward could be really useful to help us understand the effect of beneficial management practices in agricultural landscapes. Because we don't actually know which ones work and where, and yet we devote a lot of time building quite complicated models to try and predict how much nutrients are going to the stream and what happens if you implement different BMPs. So I think the way that you approach this in terms of looking at the impacts at different scales and different kinds of stream beds is really quite useful. Just a comment.
Thank you. My response would be I fully agree. I think there's a lot of understanding. The BMP example in agriculture is great, right? The exact same management practice in a sandy soil versus a loamy soil might give you very dramatically different results. And given finite resources to distribute on the landscape, we ought to be able to answer those questions ahead of time if we're going to earn our keep as a discipline, right? Which practice, which flood control measure, which nutrient management technique, how do we prioritize the buffet of options that we have? And once we start to intersect that with individual land managers and the economics of this problem, that gets beyond any of us, which I suppose is partly why all of us are in this room. Mm-hmm. Yeah, appreciate the comment, thank you.
One thing at the Andrews I find interesting with your data is that the mean transit time of the water in the stream, you said it doesn't vary with discharge based on some of the things you showed in those smaller watersheds, but I guess the catchment scale transit time, if you have some magical way to compute really the age of the water, its transit time through the whole catchment, it varies massively high to low, because low flow, you're down to a few groundwater seeps, and that could be on average 50 to 100-year-old groundwater seeping in. And then when it's raining like crazy, now that catchment transit time is maybe weeks old. So I guess what you're saying is that the additional change that the river corridor imparts is perhaps not too much across that wide range of flow conditions. Is that what you're saying?
So yes, in that the timescales of exchange and transport in the river corridor are short relative to the many decade sorts of timescales that folks like your group with the isotope tracers are working on. Absolutely, it's noise on that signal.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's quite baffling there to me. I describe this catchment as being underlain by bedrock and having these very shallow soils. It's very steep, and so it's also quite intriguing to try and think about where that water is possibly stored within the catchment, and the river corridor as sort of the last place through which it has to move in order to exit the catchment. So those timescales are fairly different from one another, and I think that actually helps us because it at least artificially lets you and I invoke different mechanisms and not get in a fight about it. Uh-huh. And as we get more and more tracers that get more and more sensitivity, where I can start to follow things for 10 years, and you can start to get resolution from your isotopes bumping into 6-8 years, right? Then we've got a problem because we're going to have two disciplines crash into each other with opposing conceptual models. And so we might think about being forward-looking about, right, those scales are okay to separate today, but as we fill that gap, we're going to find scale dependencies that just continue to complicate this. And
Right.
that's not just us at the Andrews. In fact, that's all of us. What one of us takes as a constant, a given, a boundary condition, is someone else's career. And we draw these artificial walls, and when we start to bump into them, we realize, oh, that was tough. That's a good motivation for funding, though.
Good.
Opposing
Well, that's a good
hypotheses.
philosophical thing to end with. It's just turned 4:30. I'd like to all of us join in thanking again Adam for a really excellent talk. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
And please join us out in the atrium for tea and coffee and cookies and continue the discussion. And you can chat with Adam then. Thanks very much.